Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Twyla over at the Administrative Office of the Courts, and we're pleased to welcome you today to a training being put on by Professor Vivek Sankaran of University of Michigan School of Law. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Vivek because I'm having technical difficulties. But thank you for joining us, and thank you for being here today, sir. Professor.
Yeah, thank you, Twyla, and thank you all for having me. This is really a great opportunity for us to have a conversation about something that I value quite a bit, which is compassion and how we might view the people around us and before us in judicial spaces differently. I have to say, in an ideal world, we would be around a table together having this conversation. And so I hope, but this is, far from ideal in terms of how we're communicating. And so my hope is over the next 45 minutes to an hour, I can share some thoughts about how we might view our work differently and what we all might be able to do. And then I hope people robustly use the Q&A to communicate with one another. And so, I hope that you share your thoughts, insights, and have as much of a conversation as we can through this means. And so I'm going to go ahead and share my slides and really sort of start this conversation about how we might encourage more compassionate interactions in these challenging times. So the first question I want to ask you all, and I know you're from all over the state. And you have different roles. And if you could use, I think the Q&A is going to substitute as our chat today. If you could use your Q&A right now and just share for a second when you all feel most connected in your work that you do in whatever space that is. I know that there's some judicial officers, some administrators. If you can just take a minute and just and share any thoughts you have about what about this job, like when you're truly connected with the work that you do, what are you doing, right? What aspect of your job are you enjoying most? When do you feel like you're contributing most to the sort of the operations of the court system, to the lives of the families that you interact with? And so if you could just take a minute and go to your Q&A and just share some thoughts about that. And then I can share whatever thoughts come up. And so when I'm in the courtroom dealing with the public, Noreen Hendrickson shared that. Other thoughts? And so anything about the job that that connects you with others. So collaborating with others. Feeling most connected to my role as a judge when I feel that all parties are seeking creative resolution. I love that, with the brainstorming, trying to resolve an issue right away, and having to work with several team members when training with staff. And so, it's funny, the theme that in so many of these responses is this notion of connecting with other human beings, of working together, of sort of collaborating towards a common solution to really serve and help others. So I really appreciate that. For me, many of those themes are why I'm here today. Just to tell you a little bit about my own story, I started this work kind of as a lawyer's lawyer, trying to serve children in the foster care system. I went to Michigan Law School, then graduated and went to Washington, D.C., where I worked with kids in the D.C. foster care system. And honestly, like, I went into this work thinking that my primary role and interests were in representing kids in foster care and really protecting them from what I viewed at the time as sort of bad and dangerous parents. But once, as is true with life, like once I got into the work, the narrative got complicated for me, because even though many of my clients were victims of abuse or neglect, my clients often viewed their own parents, very differently than I did as their lawyer. And many of them wanted to go back home with their families. However, however the challenges that they faced. And so I went through my practice for a couple of years, and then one day I had the opportunity, just by pure happenstance, to represent a parent in a child protective case in the foster care system. And I still remember that day like it was yesterday when I was in the courtroom on behalf of a parent walking into this familiar court building where I knew the players, I knew the lawyers, and all of a sudden I felt this judgment that I was there on behalf of this person alleged to have neglected a child. I remember hearing my client express to me how no one wanted to talk to her, how she felt judged and blamed, and was really struggling in the space. And for the first time as a lawyer, I really felt this feeling of isolation that so many families feel with the court system. And that to me was this kind of defining moment of my own legal career where I decided to leave Washington, D.C., leave, just representing kids, and came to Michigan, where I now have a practice where I spend a lot of time on behalf of parents, but also children. And this sort of story has taken me to really prioritizing and thinking about how we might view the work that we do differently, broadly in court systems, how we might view each other differently, how, when people feel alienated and isolated, whether that's families or, self-represented litigants or court staff or other professionals, how that just changes and makes our work and our common quest so difficult. And I feel that way more than ever now in these challenging times, where I feel like, the rush to judgment and the divisiveness all over the country is really fueling this need and desire on my part and the part of others to inject compassion into systems, to really work to try to understand one another as opposed to casting judgment. And so part of today and today's conversation is really about that, which is how might we adjust the frame that we bring to the work that we do in whatever setting that you do it, to better understand the human beings who are both before you in court systems and around you that you work with. And so I'm now at the law school at the University of Michigan. I just completed a year-long class certification program through Stanford Medical School on applied compassion. And so really the idea behind all of this is how do we slow down and really engage with the suffering that is all around us. And so one of the things that, and John Lewis is one of my heroes. And, I just, when I started the practice of law, I really started with this frame of trying to change outside systems, right? I spend a lot of time now doing appellate work, like to file, lawsuits, trying to, change, government agencies and court systems and however else I might do that. But one of the realizations over the years has been that for me to change outside systems, I really need to change my own frame and my heart and how I approach this work. And so really, this is kind of an invitation for all of you today as you spend this time with me, is how might we change what's in our control, right? These micro interactions that begin every single day when you take the bench, when you sit in the courtroom, when you work with families, to change the experience of those going through our systems. And I really hope that at the end of our conversation today, you walk away with one or two things that you might just try differently. Whether that's how you listen, how you ask questions, how you treat one another, how you grapple with, within our adversarial system, how do we recognize and acknowledge and act when we see suffering of anyone within our system, and how do we make sure we're creating the spaces to do that. And so really the question is, how might I use my role in the court system, whatever that role is, to reduce human suffering. So I think throughout, systems, I think right now with the judiciary, we have a crisis of connection, right? We see this, and these are just quotes of families. The majority of the work that I do is with the foster care system. And so these are just quotes of families within our system, right? That nothing was personalized, they lacked a voice, felt talked over and judged. Getting to know the family was an important piece that seemed to be missing. No one was in their corner to explain what just happened. Recently, I had a a former client of mine who's going through a custody dispute, and she's self-represented, and she was just telling me about how it felt to go into these court systems without anyone there who really saw her and saw her fears and saw her stress. And then she just felt overwhelmed by the entire process and left with a really negative impression of what systems were about. And I think, and I juxtapose that to sort of the feelings in the beginning of our conversation with what energizes us about our work. And really, it's that connecting that energizes so many of us about this work. And yet for families and litigants in the system, it seems like oftentimes that's the challenge. And so the question I want to ask you, within your own systems is what, and many of you deal with self-represented litigants or people who may not have high quality lawyers. Using the Q&A again, what are some of the words that you think people might use to describe their interactions with the court system, and what both good and bad from your experiences, like what are some of the different ways that folks might describe this process? And so let's just take a minute and collect a couple of thoughts about what people might think about the court system, whether that's self-represented folks or folks with lawyers, but just collecting, whatever your diverse experiences are. So let's just take about 30 seconds and jot down some thoughts in the Q&A again, so that we can share them with one another. Yeah, so scary and judgmental throughout the whole process. I appreciate your honesty in sharing that. Unresponsive. Yeah, frustrated, overwhelming, and frustrating. Not fair to unrepresented litigants. Yeah, so really, and what's so hard about this conversation is, I think that if any of us were to talk about how we want people to feel within our systems, none of us would use those words. And so one of the things that I hope we can get into as this conversation progresses is like, why the disconnect, right? Why is there this dissonance between what we want out of our systems and what we want our systems to look like, and how families are actually experiencing it, that level of frustration. I joke that when I told one of my friends at the law school that I'm taking a class on compassion, he was kind of like, huh, like, why would we need a class on compassion? It seems so obvious. And I think I was reflecting on that conversation, and I think in part he's right. It is obvious that I think we're hardwired. I have 3 kids, and especially when they were younger, I think compassion is something that comes naturally to younger human beings. And yet we live in a world right now where compassion is a scarce commodity, that we are so quick to judge. And as a result, many people have the feelings that you're experiencing within the court system. And then we compound a lot of that with not just how people are feeling through the systems, but oftentimes litigants have their own trauma histories. They have their own histories with court systems, with other public agencies that they bring with them to our spaces. And so it's something that I think compounds the effect that we might have within our work. I also think it's really important as we start this conversation about systems and what we might do to change the experience of litigants before us, to recognize that the work affects all of us, right? And so I'd really invite you right now to just take a quick minute in the chat to talk openly about, and if I know there's a way in the chat in the Q&A to make it anonymous, but like, how does this work affect you? Right? How does this, when you're, I know there are a number of judges on this call, court staff. I would love to take a minute just to share sort of the experience that you all have about both, I guess, good and bad, about how the work affects all of us. And I can say, as a lawyer working with families, I mean, there are times where it's exhausting, that the needs of clients are overwhelming. I feel helpless. And this work is extremely challenging. But I would love for folks just to take a minute again. Let's just collect a couple of answers and thoughts about on a human level, how does this work affect you? And so if people could share just, frustrated, yeah, I love this. I want to help more, but I cannot provide advice, right? So if you're a jurist or a court staff and you're dealing with an unrepresented litigant, um, the challenge of not being able to help when you see a problem in front of you because of ethical constraints. What else? In what other way does might this work affect you? Yeah, same thing, right? You can't provide legal advice to self-represented litigants. As people type in, answers to this question, I want to relate a conversation I had with a lawyer just the other night. My middle child plays basketball for his freshman team, and I saw a lawyer that I who does family law cases in the stands, and I've known him for many years, and he looked exhausted. And so I asked him what was going on, and he said he was burned out. And I asked him how long he might stay in the practice of law. He's been practicing for about 20 years now, and he said that he's thinking about a year, and he wants to quit. And I asked him why, and he paused for a second, and he said he related a story of a client who had a long time substance abuse history. And an addiction, and was in a custody dispute, and finally had gotten himself clean, had entered treatment, and the lawyer had just filed a motion to modify custody to allow for unsupervised parenting time, and they had a court hearing scheduled, and 2 days before the court hearing, the client overdosed and died of substance abuse, and the lawyer sort of relayed to me that since he learned of that incident, he's been reliving in his own head the moments of every interaction that he had with that client, and whether he could have done something, whether he could have noticed something. And you can hear the undercurrent of his conversation that he was in many ways blaming himself for what was going on. And then our conversation sort of shifted to this idea that there are few spaces for lawyers and judges and court staff to really talk openly and in a vulnerable way about the way that this work affects us. Because we do so much work on behalf of other people, and yet where in our systems are we talking about the work, how it affects us? And a cliche, but a saying that's used quite a bit is that pain that's not transformed is transmitted. And I think about that a lot when I think about lawyers and what I see in court sometimes, or with jurists, and some of the negative interactions that they might have because with the public or others. And I often think that sometimes it might be because there's something going on with themselves that about how this work is affecting them, and they're transmitting it to others because they haven't had a chance to process it. Because we are in a profession, for those of you who are lawyers on this call, where we have been taught and trained through professional school to be tough and hard and strong, and and the work shouldn't affect us. Hide your emotions, all of these things, and yet the reality is that's an impossible human task. And so I think that as we have a conversation about how we want to treat others in our systems, we have to acknowledge and start with this idea that this work affects us, and we need to create spaces to talk openly about that. So we know, and these are just some of the highlights, within the child protection system. The American Bar Association recently had a report talking about the crisis amongst lawyers generally in terms of burnout, mental health issues, substance abuse, alcoholism, right? So again, if we don't learn to take care of ourselves and talk about that, how might we be in a position to do that for others? And so here, my pitch to you is to try to think about how we might build a different path forward, right? How might we have a different lens in addition to our work with families, and the lens created by statutes and court rules and ethical obligations to meet the demands of the work and to address our suffering and the suffering of those before us. And I want to sort of frame to you a way of thinking about that through the lens of compassion. And if I had my way, we would be spending 2 days together, slowly sort of unpacking some of these things and incorporating principles of mindfulness and writing and group work and connection, because I think that's the way that we really get to some of this stuff. But we're going to just do a quick sort of introductory to hopefully whet the appetite, and then think about ways that we might be able to incorporate it. But what is compassion? It's a response to suffering that includes actions to relieve it. And it's always and only arises in response to suffering. And so the question for all of us, I think, is in whatever role we're in, when we see someone suffer, what might we do that's consistent with that role? And I think, especially for the lawyers on the call and the judges, like, this isn't the frame that we are taught in law school, right? The law school system is very much we have ethical obligations to our client and nobody else, and our obligations to win at all costs. And I think that we're, either subtly, implicitly, or explicitly taught to ignore the suffering of others. And I've heard this from judges as well. This idea of neutrality means that I have to ignore the suffering of others before me. And I want to push on that, right? And I want to push to think of a new path, which is, can we both honor our ethical obligations while also responding in whatever way we can, consistent with those obligations, to the suffering those around it. And as we unpack it, for me, what it has meant is a different lens that I'm viewing the world in right now. That it's almost, I'm scanning for those opportunities where I might have to make a difference in the lives of others, however big or small, whether it's listening, whether it's taking some action for my client, whether it's helping somebody in need in the ways that I can. A small example for me is recently I had learned that a foster care worker in one of my cases had lost her apartment due to a fire and had lost everything. And I don't know, like about 5, 10 years ago, I would have just, acknowledged the loss, but not really thought about what I could do about it, right? She's technically, for me in this case, an adversary. She's recommending things that my client probably wouldn't want. But I'm no longer satisfied in many ways with that sort of response. And so I took a small step, which isn't not a big deal at all, but reached out to her first to acknowledge that I knew about it, and I was worrying about her, and offered to, asked if there's any way that I could support her. And she responded back with a link to say that people are raising money for her to just pay for basic needs. And I contributed to it in not a significant way, but in a way that I think conveyed to her that she was not alone in this. And it was just a small example of I think the type of thing that I am now feel compelled to do, having adopted this new framework. And so I think, one of the reasons I started with this conversation about compassion with this question of, how is this work affecting us, is one of the muscles that we have to engage in is the idea of having self-compassion. And, Kristen Neff, who's a researcher, has done, really incredible work on self-compassion. And really what it involves is three different elements. One is mindfulness, which is the idea of just, slowing down and reflecting every day about how you are and how this work is impacting each of you, and what version of yourself are you bringing to your job every single day. And so I think that taking a minute out of your day before you sit on the bench, before you sit in a courtroom, just to think about, like, what the morning, right? And is there anything that morning that happened that might affect how you interact with another human being? And thinking about sort of any stressors that you might have that might impact your work is something that I would reflect on. Second is this idea of self-kindness, right? We, and I think an easy way to capture what that means is, if a friend of yours was feeling the same thing that you are, what might you say to them? And I think when we do this exercise, and I've done it several times, you'll realize that what you say to them is very different than what you say to yourself. Like, we often say to ourselves, things like "suck it up," or we deny our own humanity. But if you're feeling sad or tired or frustrated, as the self-talk is crucial. And third is this idea of common humanity, which is while all of us are not going through the same life experiences, all of us are experiencing struggle and suffering in some way. If this was a big room full of people, one of the things I've done in trainings is to do a word cloud on things like, how does this work affect you? And you'll see the word frustrated or hopeless or burnout kind of get bigger and bigger and bigger in this word cloud. I do this with my law students in a class that I teach about how they feel right now in that moment in law school. And we do this with first-year law students. And oftentimes the word alone, isolated, lonely, whatever it might be, just keeps getting bigger and bigger in a word cloud. And so it's just something that, that we're all connected and we don't talk about these things, but oftentimes many of the feelings that we have are similar. And so I really encourage you to develop at least some practices that starts with sort of paying attention to how you feel in this work and recognizing that you're not alone in how you feel. The research is clear about self-compassion, that it shows that it leads to more engagement in a job, more optimism, more curiosity, a positive affect. And generally speaking, it enables us to be available for others. Again, this is like the realization that comes in, far too late in the practice of law for me. This is year 20 plus of practicing law. And it's taken me that long to sort of realize that if I don't take care of myself, I'm in no position to care for others. And that, and then I think self-compassion plays a really critical role in that. So let's kind of walk through a little bit of, what the elements of this framework might look like. So one is having the space and awareness to recognize suffering. This is something that's really hard in court systems, right? Though even the word space, because we are a bustling enterprise, right? Dockets are flowing, people are coming in and out, and if you're, a court administrator or court staff, and you have people who are always coming at you, handing you paperwork, and it's really hard to have space to pay attention. And this is where, developing, a mindful practice and really paying attention to what's going on in your brain and what your attention is focused on can really play a role, because with space comes awareness, right? Are we noticing things? I remember a part of the work that I do at the clinic is at the law school is I do appellate work. So I read a lot of transcripts. And I think about a case where a mother, a child entered the foster care system because he was left alone. The mother had been drinking excessively to the point that she had passed out several times, and a kid was wandering the streets, got picked up, entered the foster care system. As I read the record, I realized that this mother had entered the system because her husband of 20 years had just passed away. And what was striking to me, I mean, many things were striking about this case, but what was striking to me is once court started, nobody at any point had said to this mother, I'm so sorry for your loss. I knew the people on this case, they're all really good people. But what we didn't create and what we don't create in systems often is the space and awareness to recognize this. Right? I think about what we would have done if that mom was a friend of ours. Right? We would certainly acknowledge her grief, or a family member. But in systems, sometimes in our quest to get things done, we are rolling through decisions and rolling through the process, and we don't slow down and have that awareness. And I think that requires also a lot of humility to notice the pain that others are experiencing. And then I think third is recognition of common humanity. I think that in systems, oftentimes we have a tendency to dehumanize those that are before us. And so one of the examples that I have that's really hard for me to talk about is a client of mine in an appellate case who I did not know that well, because we had just been appointed to the case, and in appeals, the client interaction isn't as great. And I got a call from the prosecuting attorney in the case that the mother's child had passed away while the appeal was pending. And so obviously he was calling for a very legal reason to say that the case was now moot, and because there's no reason to have an appeal. And then I, of course, asked him whether someone who knew the mother would convey the news to her. And he said, of course. And he did, and then he hung up the phone. And so I waited a day or two before I called the mother to express my own sorrow and to talk about the appeal. And I remember calling her and picking up the phone, and I said, something to the extent inartfully of, "I'm so sorry for your loss." And there was just silence on the other end of the phone. And she said, "What are you talking about?" And at that moment, I had realized that nobody had told her that her child had died in foster care. And then she just let out, what I can only describe as sort of this primal wail of, and how the grandmother was there as well. Same sort of just screaming on the phone of just grief. And it was one of those like moments that'll always stay with me. That I was just thinking, what is going on with our systems that nobody thought to tell this mother that her child had passed away in foster care? And I think part of it is this recognition that we aren't necessarily treating those before us like we would our own family and friends. And so and again, it's core, it's this idea of common humanity. And finally, it's this notion of, how do we generously interpret suffering in a way that gives the benefit of the doubt to the person before us. Right. So when someone says that they're experiencing something, how do we start with a default of believing what they're saying as opposed to trying to poke holes, come up with the counter narrative? And we're going to go through some of these things in a little bit more detail. And so as we think about compassion and breaking it down, I would think about it in 4 different ways. And I would really encourage all of you, as you're thinking about how to bring this framework into your own practice, it's going to be different for every single person on this call. And so start jotting down moves that you can make if anything hits you, as what are habits you can develop to help notice, interpret, feel, and act in a compassionate way. So noticing, right? So however, how can you, in the role that you are in, know more about the lives of people, including their difficulties? And I think the second prong about how might we be more comfortable knowing about people's difficulties. And this is really hard. And this is one of these skills that I am slowly trying to cultivate in my own sort of daily life and practice, which is getting comfortable knowing about people's challenges, even when I can't solve them. And in the Q&A earlier, when people had said one of the frustrating things about this job is not being able to solve problems, I think that is true, right? That many of the litigants before us come with needs that court systems can't necessarily solve, but there's a value in an inherent just worth of people feeling heard. And the research talks about this. There's all this stuff about procedural justice. But just, being a witness, being present, allowing someone to speak to you and hearing them, and hearing their challenges in an open and honest way is in and of itself an act of compassion. And so think about how do you, position yourself in whatever role you're in and with whatever time that you have, right? This doesn't have to be a time-consuming process to convey to somebody else that you are okay with them sharing this thing with you, because we have a world where people don't feel comfortable sharing a lot. And what can I do as a person to signal to somebody else that I want to be the type of person that shares this information, and that I would pay attention if they do that. Interpreting, right? How might we create reminders for ourselves that all people are good, capable, and worthy of compassion? A good friend of mine, Amelia Frank Meyer, who directs an agency in Minneapolis, has this thing that she does, and I'm going to get it wrong, but when she's on the airplane, when she watches people walk by, she tries to envision how their mothers might think of them, right? To really get her into this generous spirit. There's a book called Invisible Child by Andrea Elliott. It's a really beautiful book. And she has this thought process that she engages in, which is to try to imagine the parents that she's following who are homeless and addicted to drugs, and try to imagine what they were like as little kids, as toddlers, and how they, interacted with the world when they are so lovable. And for her, she talks about how that really helped her reframe the person that she saw and reminded her of the inherent goodness in all of us. And this, I have to say, I mean, is really hard, right? It's really hard because when people are in court systems, they are angry, they're tired, they're frustrated, they're presenting with so many challenges to all of you that you then expecting you to solve things that are intractable. And so, how might we create little reminders that these people are inherently good and worthy of compassion? And how might we inquire when they are challenging to inquire about why they are behaving in a certain way, in a way that doesn't create blame necessarily, because we've all had these moments where we're at our least best, and how might we generously interpret the reasons behind it? And I think central to that is this idea of what many call parallel universe thinking, right? And I do this with my law students because they often have situations where clients don't call them back or they get frustrated, and immediately we go to explanations that blame the client, right? She doesn't like me. She doesn't want to talk to me. She doesn't value lawyers. She doesn't do this. She doesn't do that. And what we do is an exercise where we jot down on a piece of paper all the things and all the reasons why a client might be behaving in a certain way. And then that starts to slowly expand their thinking, because perhaps it is because their phone isn't working. Perhaps it's because there are more pressing things on their mind other than legal help. For oftentimes we think we're the center of the universe, but they might not have food in the house. They may not have childcare. Perhaps they're sick. Perhaps they're going through a mental health crisis. There's a million reasons, and so can we think about other ways to explain why a client might behave a certain way, or a litigant might behave a certain way, before we jump to a conclusion that it has to do with us and the hostility is related to us? And so I would really invite you all to try to think about, in your spaces, how might we broaden our horizons. Feeling, right? So, really stepping into the shoes of another. Right? How might we remind ourselves to see things from the perspective of another? How might we minimize distractions and emphasize listening? We've all been in the presence of somebody who listens in a way that is so deep and attentive that it leaves us transformed, right? Immediately, I can think of a handful of people that I know that when I am with them, I know that I am with them 100%. And so how might you develop that mindset where when a litigant is before you, whether you're staff or a judge, how might you be so locked in that they know and they leave that space thinking that regardless of what you ruled, they felt fully heard, right? So how can we be mindful and present so we acknowledge the suffering that we witness every single day? And then the idea of acting, right? So how do we first act and be present in such a way that the presence itself is an act of compassion that impacts another human being? And then this is where I think thinking creatively about how might we, brainstorm ways within our roles to address the suffering that we see. I think that could be a conversation. It could be an act within our role that we can do to acknowledge it. It could be sharing with others what we're seeing in our systems, right? If there are common problems that are coming up in your court systems that really aren't judicial responses or legal responses, but are community needs, what are we doing to share what we're seeing with others, right? One of the things, in the foster care system that got me really to work on behalf of parents as well as children is I was seeing the suffering that so many of my child clients were experiencing by not seeing their parents, regardless of how flawed their parents were. They wanted those relationships. And I felt compelled as a child's lawyer to start sharing that perspective with others, because too often systems were so punitive towards the parents due to the acts that had occurred. And so how might we cultivate this act of sharing the suffering that we see? And then third, the idea of common humanity and creating reminders that we are not alone, and that the folks who appear before us are really no different than all of us in so many ways. and this recognition that suffering is a part of who we are. I suspect that if all of us were in a room together and we all wrote down confidentially something that is not going well in our lives, whether that's an illness or financial struggles, mental health struggles, relationship issues, whatever it might be, we are all going through something that is part of the human experience, that we are all experiencing struggle and challenges in some way. And so as we see others before us, can we use that as a way to bind us together, that we're all on this journey throughout, and can we help each other as we go through this together? And so I want to just take a minute as we think about some of the principles of compassion. We've all experienced it, right? So I would love for folks to just think for a minute of a time that they've either witnessed it, received it, or given compassion to someone else, and just put again in the Q&A, if we can get a couple of reflections here of what happened. And it could be really short, just a couple of sentences, but how it felt to either be the giver of compassion or the recipient of it, as we sort of tease out what this might look like in the different roles that you're in. And so I would love just to spend a moment, if you can put in the Q&A anything about sort of a time where you saw compassion in action, and talk a little bit about just a couple of sentences about what happened and what you observed or how it felt, so we can put some teeth on some of these abstract concepts. So just take a quick minute, if you can type it in the Q&A, because I think that part of what I love to do is sort of share the wisdom that you all have from your experiences in your courts with others on this call, because we don't get a chance to do that often. So just take a minute and see if you can, if a couple of folks would respond. And so we're thinking about sort of times where you've either seen it, you've experienced it, or you've given compassion to somebody else, and just kind of what happened and how that felt. And this is kind of the Zoom limitations, which is if we were all in a room together, we'd be in small groups, sort of talking about it. And so, if folks don't have things that come to mind, just putting it in the Q&A as they do would be something that would be helpful, I think, to all of you within these spaces. What I want to do is share a quick video of what I see as compassion in action. This is a judge from the Seattle area who passed away several years ago. And what I'd love for you to do is to jot down, as you're watching this video, what some of the moves that she used to show compassion. And the sound will start in about a minute, about 30 seconds.
Very nice Attorney General.
Hi,
Hi,
how are you?
I've been better.
Yeah, where you been?
Not doing my services.
That's right. But I'm delighted to see you today.
Yeah, it's time to
Okay.
face the music.
Yep, it is. So talk to me.
I'm not doing so good,
Okay,
but I made it here.
Yep.
And I'm honest about it. I'm ready to do what I need to do. So it's about where I'm at right now.
okay. So where do you think we should start?
I don't know.
I need you to stay in contact with your social worker
Okay,
twice a week. Okay,
You can
that's
do
it.
that. I got it.
Okay, if I can get you to stay in contact long enough for us to get you stable, it's gonna be a lot better.
I hope so.
Yeah. Trust me. Just stay on the telephone if you need to, okay? So we're gonna start this little process,
Okay,
baby steps.
good.
Yep, baby
That's about
steps.
all I can handle right now.
That's okay. We're not going anywhere. Baby steps. Okay? And one of those baby steps is to keep showing up here. Okay? Even if it's bad,
Okay,
okay? If you can get it together to keep walking through that door, we can get there. Okay?
okay.
All right.
So again, if folks are willing to use the Q&A as a chat, I would love to think about what did this judge do, right? What are some of the moves that she used in this short, 2-minute clip to connect with this client who was struggling and show compassion. I love the answer if she showed grace and met the client where she was. Right, as somebody who has been through many foster care cases, that hearing could have gone so many different ways. Right, a client who had not done services, not kept in touch with people, not done screens, and yet the first pivot by the judge was to say, well, that you're here and we can build on that. What a powerful way to recognize sort of something good that was happening and move on. I love it. Didn't blame the client, but encouraged her for consistent effort. Assurance, right? Showing sincere compassion, right? That authenticity of how do we show up in a way that doesn't that actually genuinely conveys to somebody that that we're connected with them. She listened, right? And I think one of the things that I've learned, over the years is that listening happens not just with your ears, but really with your whole body, right? And the body language, and how do we, nod our head and really engage and stay connected. A couple of times the judge said, "We are going to do this," right? The idea that we're in this together. And so, what I love about this video, and Diane's point about looking directly at her and speaking with a quiet and loving tone, and acknowledging the realities. I think that's an important point, that she acknowledged the realities of a lack of compliance, but also encouraged her for being there as a step towards moving forward. Another act of compassion, I think, by the judge was also setting very realistic benchmarks of saying, just stay in touch with your caseworker, show up to court, and then we can build on that for the coming weeks, as opposed to really overwhelming the client with lots of things. And so I just like this video because it's like 2 minutes long, but there's just so much there about how each of us, in whatever role that we're in, can make these micro moves to help then families feel more connected with the court system. So one of the things to think about, and I'd love to sort of, again, use the chat for this, is like, why is this so hard? So I go back to my colleague, right? The one who said a compassion class, it sounds kind of fun, but like, why do you need this, right? Why do you need a class or this? Because it sounds obvious, and yet we live in a world where compassion is such a challenge, especially within court systems. And I would love for folks to reflect for a second about why this is so difficult. Right? What is the challenge that we face? Why I go back to the words that people used in the beginning: frustrated, unresponsive. That's how self-represented litigants often feel. And yet I assure you, I don't know any of you on this call, or I might, but I don't know offhand how I might know you, but like, I suspect none of you on this call if I asked you what you want people to think of the systems they navigate, would want those words. And so I would appreciate, in the Q&A, if folks can say and offer some thoughts about what makes this such a hard task for all of us, right? What makes it so hard? And this is sort of, joint ownership between lawyers and court staff and judges, I think we're all in this pursuit together, and we're far from creating the types of systems and experiences that we want people to have. And so I'd invite people to offer any thoughts they might have about the why, and about sort of the reasons why people are experiencing systems the way they do. Right, that level of frustration. What prevents all of us collectively from creating the very system that we want on behalf of litigants in whatever type of case that you deal. And so I would invite you put it in the Q&A as you come up with sort of reasons or share things. Some of the things that I think the research shows is, first, that every day our brains undermine compassion. Right. So, even though I think in some ways we're hardwired to have a compassionate mindset, when we come out of and are born, one of the things that our brains do have is this negativity bias, right? This idea that we're always scanning for threats, and this is something that comes from many years ago when there were real threats, and so whenever we feel threatened in some way, we can often get triggered, and this happens to all of us every single day. Something is capable of setting us off, and if we don't acknowledge it and pay attention to it, then we can let it derail how we want to act in the world. I think of a time where a colleague of mine I found out that she had done something without including me. A decision was made, and my primordial brain had gotten hijacked. My amygdala had gotten hijacked, and all of a sudden my emotions were just getting the best of me. And so I was just sending off text after text after text. And I look back sort of in embarrassment now about the types of my reaction, but I just didn't have that moment of mindfulness that could have allowed me to act in a way that I wanted to act. One of my favorite sayings, and it's been attributed to a million different people over the years, is that between stimulus and response, there's space. And in that space is where growth occurs. And in that space is where we become the human beings that we want to be. But so often there's no space between stimulus and response, right? Litigant says something to you, judge, and the judge reacts. Litigant says something, the client says something to a lawyer yells at them. Parent says something to a caseworker, and caseworker gets upset because our emotions are getting the best of us. And how might we create some space to allow for us to respond in a much more skillful way? I think another thing that you often see is a fundamental attribution error, which is that we blame things on people, not situations and contexts, unless we're talking about ourselves. And that's what the research has shown, that when we interpret our own behavior, we're often blaming external forces for why we might be a certain way. And yet when other people do something, we're blaming the individual, not the context or the systems for that. We often have confirmation bias, right? You've seen one family, you've seen them all, or you have one challenging client and you're assuming and looking for ways to confirm that everyone is going to be that way before you. And I think, both all of this stuff is sort of compounded by our ego and sort of this notion of groupthink, that we all sort of gang up together and start really thinking in similar ways. And once we view litigants in a certain way, it can spread sort of throughout communities in terms of how people are thought of. There's also physical factors, right? We all know that we're far less likely to be compassionate towards another human being when we are fatigued. It could be because of a lack of sleep. It could be because of illness. When we ourselves face stress, when we don't have time, when we're hungry. There was a great study that was done a number of years ago about litigants and court systems and how hunger affected how they would act in front of jurists. This idea, we don't even think about it, right? Like, we don't even think about the fact that if you're really hungry and haven't had a meal in a couple of days or a couple of hours or whatever it might be, it can affect how you act before a court system. And so a program was started in Washington State to provide snacks and food to people in court spaces for free, as a means of reducing that level of stress and physical ailments that might then transform into how people act within court systems. And so one of the things, that I hope is that if we can do some of these things, and see each other in a far more humane way, we will understand that all of us, in whatever system that we operate, sort of carry with us, joys and burdens. And so I want to show the short video that the Cleveland Mayo Clinic put out, that is incredibly powerful. I think it speaks to, New York columnist, New York Times columnist Frank Bruni wrote a book about his eyesight issues and losing his vision. And he talked about how, as he started talking openly about this challenge he was facing, more and more people felt open to talking to him about the challenges that they were facing. And then he sort of wrote this op-ed about, what if each of us could have a sandwich board that had in front of us the burden that we were carrying, and if we had that, how might that change the interactions between all of us, right? If I knew you were going through a divorce, or you lost a child due to COVID, or you were suffering from being evicted, or you had food insecurity, might that then completely be a game changer in how we act towards one another? And so I'm going to show this video because I think it gets to this point about, and gets us to think about the people within our universes in a far different way than we might ordinarily think of them. So it's such a powerful video. I invite folks to share in the chat, the Q&A, sort of any immediate reactions that they have to the stories. I think the thing that, I mean, there's so many things that strike me about this video that applies to the work that we all do. One is this idea that these stories are everywhere, right? Every single day before each of us, whether we're dealing with clients or litigants or whoever it might be, everyone has these stories. There's nothing unique in this video about the stories that these individuals are sharing. We all have them before us, and it's our jobs and our obligation as people to discover them. And we can only discover them, if we really think about compassion as something that we want to prioritize. And second, this notion that that if we are able to discover these stories, and I think that the video gets it correct, we fundamentally change how we interact with one another. And so part of our if we really want to change systems, going back to the John Lewis quote that we began with, I think it starts with our own transformation of noticing, paying attention, illuminating these stories that people share with us. And so, I actually did share with Twyla and others, and hopefully you'll get it, the science behind compassion, right? So this works. In the medical field, there's so many studies out there that this framework can do so much to improve the lives of not just the person receiving compassion, but also the person giving it. It is empowering. It reduces burnout of folks doing the work because they feel like something that they're doing is actually making a difference. Oftentimes, burnout results when you do a lot of work and you don't feel like you're making any impact. And what we see in this compassionate framework is that it's actually energy giving to the person giving compassion because they're seeing that human connection that then gives them the why about why they're doing this work. So for those of you interested in doing a deeper dive, there's a really great book with a lot of these studies called Compassionomics. That it's kind of an academic researchy book, but they have a lot of the evidence. But I've pulled a lot of that stuff out for you if you need to cite it to. I mean, there's kind of the human case for compassion, but there's also the numbers case. And so I'd really, if you're interested in some of the research, definitely take a look at that. And really, I want to end with just this quote that for me, I think brings home sort of the why, right? I think that for me, even though I entered the practice of law with a very narrow focus to try to help kids in foster care, the more I do this work, the more I recognize that all of us are on this journey throughout life, and that we all have struggles, that we're all, face challenges and burdens. And part of the whole endeavor here is to try to figure out within our roles how we can walk with each other, how we can support each other, and how we can make life a little bit easier for one another. And so I would really encourage you to think about within your role as you go to work, for the rest of the day today or tomorrow, thinking about some of these principles. What are the things within your control? Right? There are going to be things that are outside your control. It's what my colleague and I call gravity problems, right? We can't change gravity. And so let's not try to. But what can I do? What's within our control? What are those conversations that you can have that are different? What are those hearings that you can conduct differently, that might really have an impact on another human being? So I want to thank you for this opportunity to come before you. If folks have questions, happy to answer them on the Q&A. But it's really been a pleasure, and I really want to applaud the court system for prioritizing this type of conversation, because I think it's exactly, the types of conversations we need to have in our quest to change systems. So with that, Twyla, I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you, Vivek, and thank you so much for presenting today. If there's any questions, if you're okay with it, I can definitely email if anybody emails me questions. And oops. Oh, you have a thank you. I thought there might be a question. And I know we're running short on time and people probably have to get back to wherever they're supposed to be, but if there's any questions right now, we can try to address them, but I'm also happy to forward them. We do have those articles and Tesha's going to send them out. And we'll get those out to everybody. If you don't get them, please just reach out to us. And we are recording, so this also will be available for those that ended up not being able to make it. Or if you just want to share it with somebody or even rewatch it. Vivek, though, thank you again for taking the time today. And I not seeing any questions. Don't know if there are hands in this format. I'm back on a computer now, so at least I have buttons to push.
Right, and I'm happy, Twyla, if folks my email is in the PowerPoint. So if things come up or if people want to do a deeper dive, I would really encourage, if especially in local courts, if they're interested in these conversations, there's exercises. It really is something that this was sort of a quick overview, but really, this is it's a slow process to develop sort of the habits to mindfully do this work. And so I'm happy to share additional resources and exercises with people.
And definitely, and we'll assist if any courts are interested as much as we can. I know that, when you and I have talked, we've talked about, sometimes, it's a slow thing, but just reframing how things are referenced or how even interactions are referenced, such as changing attention seeking to support seeking.
Yeah.
So yeah, definitely, we're more than happy to assist with more in-depth organizations too.
Sounds good. Well, thank you all, and you all have a great rest of the day.
Thank you, sir. You too.
All right, take care.
Everyone.